Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Julie Sweetkind-Singer, the Senior Associate University Librarian for Collections and Public Services. It's my pleasure to welcome you in person and to our live audience via Zoom to the 15th Dr. Sam Chung-Hsieh Memorial Lecture. As an intellectual nexus of the campus, the Stanford Libraries offer students, faculty, and scholars online and offline environments to explore, investigate, and collaborate. With a network of over 20 libraries and centers, visitors can engage with primary resources, connect with journals, articles, databases, and data, partner with subject matter experts and assignments and research, and discover ways to access and manipulate collections of digital libraries across the globe. Before we introduce today's speaker, I would like to tell you a bit about the history of the Hsieh Memorial Lecture. The family of Dr. Sam Chung-Hsieh, some of who are here in person and some who are tuning in online today, donated his personal archive to the Stanford Library Special Collections and endowed the Dr. Sam Chung-Hsieh Memorial Lecture Series in honor of his legacy and to inspire future generations. Dr. Sam Chung-Hsieh was born on November 13, 1919 in Guangdong, mainland China. He received his PhD in production economics from the University of Minnesota. He began his career with the Sino-American Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction in Taiwan as senior specialist, chief economist, and later secretary general. He served as professor at the National Taiwan University and as visiting professor at the Ford Foundation-sponsored University of Philippines Cornell University Joint Graduate Program. When the Asian Development Bank was first established in Manila, the Philippines, in 1966, he served as the director of Projects Department until 1981, when he returned to Taiwan to become deputy chairman of the Council for Economic Planning and Development. From 1983 to 1989, he was chairman of the Bank of Communications, Taiwan's National Development Bank. He was appointed as governor of the Central Bank of China, a position he held from 1989 to 1994. And from 1994 to 1999, he served as the chairman of the Executive Board of China Trust Bank. From 1999 to 2003, he served as chairman of the Industrial Bank of Taiwan. Additionally, he served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Rice Research Institute, IRRI, a member of the Board of Directors of the Metropolitan Bank and Trust in Manila, Philippines, chairman of the Tsinghua Institution for Economic Research, and as deputy chairman of the Cross-Straits Exchanges Relations Council with mainland China. Dr. Hsieh was married to Alice Hsieh for 58 years. They had 2 sons, 2 daughters, and 11 grandchildren. He passed away on April 24, 2004 in Los Angeles, California at the age of 85. Here is a list of the past speakers in this lecture series. As you can see, we have been very fortunate to have an incredible selection of speakers over the years, and we are delighted to include Professor Maggiori in this group. With that, I will hand it over to Hongbin Li, co-director of the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, Senior Fellow of Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and Senior Fellow for the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, to introduce today's guest speaker. Stanford Libraries and Sky have been partnering since 2019 to bring the Memorial Lecture to campus, and we're thrilled to be collaborating again on this year's lecture.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So I'm one of the faculty co-directors of SKY, Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions. For those of you who don't know us, so we are Stanford's Center for Evidence-Based, Empirical, Multidisciplinary Research on China. So we have, our goal is to foster cutting-edge research, create impactful student experiences, and help the public to better understand China's economy, governance, and society. So across campus, we have over 30 affiliated faculty and researchers. including today's speaker, Professor Matteo Maggiori. So Professor Maggiori is the Moghadam Family Professor of Finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. His research focuses on international macroeconomics and finance, combining theory and data with the aim of improving international economic policy. His research topics have included the analysis of exchange rates on the imperfect capital markets, capital flows, the international monetary system, reserve currencies, geoeconomics, tax havens, very long-run discount rates, and climate change, and expectations and portfolio investment. So today's topic, geoeconomics and the US-China great power competition, cannot be more timely. So when I invited Matteo to give the lecture a few months ago, we know there's a competition, but we didn't expect a competition like this, like today. So Matteo is also a faculty research fellow at NBER and a research affiliate at the Center for Economic Policy Research. He's a co-founder and director of the Global Capital Allocation Project. He received a PhD from not far away from UC Berkeley. And also importantly, so he's my neighbor. So we literally live across the street from each other on campus, actually. Just like maybe like 10 meters away. So he has a long list of honors. I just want to name a few. He's the recipient of the Fisher Black Prize awarded to an outstanding financial economist under the age of 40. The Carnegie and Guggenheim Fellowships and Bonnetier Prize for outstanding contributions in macroeconomics and finance by European economists under the age of 40. So you can see he's very young. Today, Matteo will give his presentation, and then we'll take questions from the audience. The event today will be recorded, and the recording will be available soon after the event. So without further ado, Matteo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight with you. Let me thank the Stanford Libraries and the Stanford China Center for inviting me to give this talk. It's quite an honor to give a talk named after Dr. Xie. I looked up his life, and he clearly had a remarkable life, and it was very pleasant to meet his children a few moments ago. So the topic couldn't be of more importance, and hopefully you can put up my slides so that my little ugly face disappears. My slides are much more interesting than my picture. Let's see. Just advance. OK. It's my fault, as it turns out. Great. So today, we're going to talk about geoeconomics. And if you're here, it's probably because you've seen this in the news. There has been a plethora of headlines. Literally, there was one moments ago with NVIDIA declaring a large loss because the US has imposed further controls on exporting chips. But you can see, Trump a few days ago announced extraordinarily high tariffs, then walked them back somewhat. If you look at the European Union, they're thinking, how do we want to shape our own economy to isolate us from potential pressure? China has been at this game for quite a long time, doing the Belt and Road Initiative. But I don't want you to think that this is just the headlines of the last few years. If you go back to like Renaissance and the Medici having their bank being central to finance of that era, or you think of the British Empire playing a great power game with Russia over India and parts of the Middle East. Here I have books that go back at least a century. If you think of the current competition of China and the US, nothing to me makes it more visual than thinking about these two countries competing on getting minerals out of Zambia. So the US has been financing a railroad project called the Lobito Corridor that essentially takes the minerals out of Zambia through Angola onto the Atlantic coast. China is trying to finance a project that takes the same minerals from the same location through Tanzania into the Pacific coast. So as you can see that they're trying to get these things back to their respective country. And it makes it visual that this competition is going on. And this is just one of the examples. Now, if you don't know what geoeconomics is, here's a simple definition. Here's my definition. is large countries like the US or China using the strength that comes from their existing finance and trade relationships with the rest of the world to achieve either economic goals or political goals. And there's a whole host of questions that have very large consequences for all of our lives. Namely, is this power a thing? Does it even exist, or is it just governments that like to pretend that they can play this game? If it exists, what are the sources of this power? And how is it actually wielded? Even more important for all of us, is this power a good or a bad thing? Is this a zero-sum game where if I have power over you, you don't over me? Is this destroying the global economy? Or is this something that makes the economy work? Is this something that ultimately we need to make a certain part of the global economy work? You can think of which sectors are strategic. Clearly, if we don't have good definitions and measurement of a strategic sector, the problem is going to be politicians will want to use it for all sorts of things. It's very easy to claim that something is in the national interest as long as the national interest is vaguely defined. If you go further down, if you're the Europeans and you're being subject to this, how would you want to protect your economy? Is there a trade-off? Do you protect it too much or too little? Do you give up too much on the gains from trade for being overly secure? Ultimately, as academics, we would like to inform policy. So how do we measure this whole thing? So today, I'll try to provide you at least my answers to many of these topics. And here's the roadmap. So we'll start by defining what this power is, and looking also a little bit at the intellectual history behind this topic. Then I'll try to take apart a few words that these days you read all the time in the newspapers. Things like a threat or a choke point, and try to demystify them and give not only a theoretical content, but also one that we can try to measure to the data. What are these things and how do we find them in the data? We'll think a little bit, I promise only a little bit, about theory, in particular theory of optimal policy. What should be our advice to policymakers regarding international security? And what should be our advice about international organizations or multilateral commitments? Are these things of the past, the things that we want to reshape and serve us in the future? And then more fun, we'll talk about measuring these things. And we'll take two approaches. One that economists talk about in terms of sufficient statistics. Think of it as measuring some simple objects in the data that our models tell us are interesting for a reason. The second one I'm infinitely excited about. We released a paper a few hours ago on this, so it's very fresh, so take it with a grain of salt, but I was just too excited about it not to put it on the slide, which is how do we use artificial intelligence to go after this? And so I'll tell you about that at the end. Okay, so let's get started. First, this talk is co-sponsored by an Institute of Political Science, and I'm an economist, so I would be remiss if I don't talk about the beautiful history of this topic and thought that comes from political science. In fact, I would say that as economists, we have reduced the notion of power too much to be a synonym with market power. The idea that you can sell your goods at a markup compared to cost. Now, that's certainly a form of power, but when we say that a large country or a corporation is powerful, we really mean something much broader than the ability to charge a markup. And in political science, there have been a number of very intriguing concepts about this. So going all the way back to the 50s, here's a definition. A has power over B if we can induce B to do something that he wouldn't want to do. You can think of that as relational power. It's like a government or a corporate that induces somebody else to take an action that they wouldn't want to take. More interestingly, Strange, a political scientist, talked about structural power. The idea that I might not be doing this individually, I might be doing it system-wide with many, many other players, and what I'm really doing is I'm changing the overall equilibrium. So think of it like setting the rules of the game, or changing very aggregate variable. How many people participate in the US payment system? That's an aggregate object of interest, and I get power by convincing everybody that should be in a system that I control. So it's a very different notion. Unfortunately, these notions tend to be hard to operationalize. So they're a little vague, and vagueness comes with two costs. Number one, theoretical clarity, what do we exactly mean? Number two, ability to measure things and figure out what's big and what's small. If you think of economics, there is a long and unjustly forgotten history of this topic in economics. So I'm going to quickly highlight one of the intellectual heroes of mine. Hirschman in the 1940s wrote a book. This was a young economist coming out of World War II, thinking about Nazi Germany before the war, exerting this kind of power over neighboring nations. And he writes this really amazing book that not only has a distaste for what we call mercantilism. the doctrine that there is a fixed amount of resources and we're just bargaining over them. Economists don't like that doctrine. We think that trade in financial assets or trade in goods and services is not a zero-sum game. The pie goes up or the pie shrinks. We're not bargaining over a fixed set of resources. At the same time, it was pretty dismissive of a simple laissez-faire view that the best way to achieve the biggest possible pie is to always ignore issues of power, that this will take care of itself. So it's this middle area that I think is very familiar to people that work on geoeconomics that he put forward. And it's beautiful because it gives this very simple theory of power imbalances. And it provides an index that if you've never heard of, it's called the Hirschman-Herfindahl index. It's nothing else than the idea that if you diversify all of your trading partners a lot, nobody has power over you. But if it turns out that your trading partners are very, very concentrated with a few relationships, those people might have some power over you. And 60, 70 years later, we're revisiting these indexes. It turns out it's not quite right. You can do better. But that's with a lot of further research. And so it's really an incredible insight. Now, you don't have to take my word that we forgot about this. To make it fun, I pulled out of Google Scholar all the citations of this book. And what you can see is that it starts in economics. Then economics forgot about this, and political science really picked it up. It became a foundational text for IPE. And my goal is to push that right line back up, to get me and my colleagues in economics to do something about this. We should be thinking about this. Why would we forget? There's lots of good things that we can say about these issues, and hopefully we get there. The world certainly seems to demand it, that we should be thinking about this topic. Now, let's make it concrete. So what the notion of power that I'm going to use? So on the left, I will do mathematics, which you can ignore. On the right, I will do a simple example, which you can pay attention to. So imagine that there is a firm. Let's pick ASML, which is a Dutch producer of lithography machines. And it's sitting there and it's operating by itself. It's making its private decisions of where to buy its inputs and where to sell, okay? Undisturbed. Then a hegemon like the US comes around and threatens them. It says, if you don't do what I say, I will make your life difficult. Now, allegedly, and this is allegedly, and we will return to the word allegedly in a second, towards the end of the talk, they threaten imposing foreign direct product rule. It's essentially a legislation of the US that allows them to directly regulate a foreign company as long as they're using inputs that come from the US. So if you don't do that, I will take you over with this legislation. On the other hand, rather than just simply threatening, you might promise something. For example, you might tell the company that you promise that if they comply, there will be a very favorable regulatory regime for them in the US, or they might get orders from the military or from some state entity. So you can think of a game of either an inducement or a threat. Ultimately, there is a demand. In the particular case of SML, the demand was, please do not sell advanced lithography machines to a particular list of entities in China. There was a very specific demand. So you can think of it as, that's a costly action. That's what A is asking B to do. They wouldn't want to do it, you're asking them. Why does the company comply, or when does it comply, when it's better off from doing so? So it's what economists call the participation constraint. In this case, ASML actually went along, and the Dutch government did too, and they complied with the request because it would have been too expensive not to do it. So if you think of one very operational notion of power, it's simply the largest gap that I can induce between the best I can promise you and ask you for nothing in return, and the worst that I can threaten and ask you for nothing in return. Anything in the middle, I can induce you to take. That's, however, only a very micro notion of power. That's if I bargain with you individually. But of course, I'm going to do that with a whole host of entities. So there is another notion which is more interesting of macro power, which is I'm going to use the demands that I ask of you to shape the equilibrium in my favor. If you think about why the US is asking so much out of ASML, it's not the direct interest in that machine. It's the indirect impact that the availability of that machine in China, in the eyes of the US government, has on semiconductor productions, which in turn will go into a lot of technology, which in turn will go into both military uses and non-military uses. So ultimately, what you're doing is you're trying to shape this entire equilibrium in your favor, and that's where the macro power comes from. Now, I made this very simple with a particular threat. If you think about in the data, or these days, if you open the news, threats come by the minute. In fact, probably in the last few minutes, there were a few that I missed that came online. And you can think of all these different things. So part of our job in our research was provide simple models of all of these threats so that we can start thinking about when do they work, how do you measure them, how do you think about them. And let me give you 2 examples, okay? I promise you I'm going to make this simple. So let's think about the most basic threat, which is I'm not going to give you the inputs you need. I control oil, I control the payment system. I will simply kick you out from the ability to use this input. When does that matter? Well, if you work out the math, it really matters under 2 circumstances. First, I control a lot of that input. For example, I am OPEC and I control a lot of the oil supply. Or I'm the US and I control a payment system for which there is almost no alternative. Second, that's the omega. That's the fraction of what the rest of the world spends on this thing that you control. Sigma is a technological parameter. It's what economists call the elasticity of substitution. If you demystify the word, it means, can you easily find an alternative somewhere else from a technological perspective? So you can see the power is very nonlinear in these 2 things. Where do I really have you is when I control almost everything on these inputs, and it's extremely difficult to rearrange production away from it. So if you haven't heard the word choke point, which these days is in the news a lot, that's what a choke point is. Think of it as an industry that has these 2 characteristics. Okay? And the SWIFT, the payment system, is a typical example. You can flip it and say, look, rather than threatening that I'm not going to sell you something, I could threaten that I'm not going to buy something from you. That's a threat that the US makes very often these days, is the imposition of tariffs on US imports. The president threatened Colombia, the country, that if they didn't accept deportation planes, the US was going to impose extremely high tariffs on exports or imports from the US from Colombia. That's a threat not to buy things, essentially, to make it difficult to buy. When does that matter? It matters under 2 conditions. First, I need to have a very large absorption market, consumption plus use as intermediates. Clearly, if you're the US and China, that threat might be powerful, because it's difficult to find another mouth the size of China or the US. If you're Italy, where I'm from, not so much, because there are many countries that can absorb the demand that Italy doesn't put into the market. So similarly, you find a big nonlinearity. It's a choke point in reverse. Now, why are you doing this? You're doing it ultimately because you hope to depress the price of their exports, starve them of export revenue so that they cannot buy imports. So ultimately, the threat not to buy and the threat not to sell are quite connected. This played a large role, for example, in Russia sanctions. The US led a coalition that, in some sense, tried to impede buying oil and gas from Russia to starve them of revenue following the invasion of Ukraine. One of the reasons why it wasn't as effective is that China and India became buyers, and they're very large buyers. And so that's an alternative buyer out there that is going to make it difficult for you to get power. If China and India had gone along with the threat and everybody had stopped buying, that would have probably had a much bigger impact as a threat. Now, in our work, we do lots of this, but I'm not going to spend much more time except one example that I think is very, very, very important in practice. The way I've come to think of these large countries is that they're coordination devices. If you're the US, you're trying to master an alliance. You're saying, come into the club, come into my economic network, and you have to take some actions and play by some rules. If you actually deviate, if you don't comply, I will retaliate across the board. It might include foreign aid, tariffs, the payment system. It might include sectors from other countries that are part of my alliance. So what creates a lot of enforcement, a lot of power, is the ability of the State Department or the White House to coordinate seemingly unrelated activities in the private sector together. And you can imagine that creates all sorts of political economy issues of why are the private sector help you to go along with this. So that's very powerful. Now, these are my 3 insights for optimal policy. They require a lot of math. I'm not going to do any of that, but hopefully they're very intuitive to you, and now we're going to go data. Okay? So let me start with the first one, building power. The reason why I care so much about it is that it provides a very different rationale for many of the policies that you're familiar with. For example, think of tariffs. The typical argument for tariffs is, I'm trying to manipulate the terms of trade in my favor. What does that actually mean? I'm trying to make my export expensive and my imports cheap, so that for everything I ship abroad, I can buy a lot of imports. But if you're thinking of building power, it might go the other way around. You might want to make your exports very cheap, kill the ability of the rest of the world to produce these things, make them very dependent on you, and then exert power. Think of like dollar financing or the dollar payment system. The US doesn't want it to be expensive. The US wants it to be cheap from everybody's perspective of using it, because then everybody's going to be on it, and the threat of kicking any one party out is extremely powerful. Similarly, I mentioned at the beginning thinking about optimal policy. So these days, many countries, Australia, the UK, Japan, the European Union, are instituting what are called economic security policy. They're thinking, how do we shape our own economy to withstand potential threats from the US or China? And I'm going to argue that, unfortunately, there's a very deep trade-off between the gains from trade and economic security. Why? Because the typical argument that one makes, Steve Redding was a world leader in trade, is here. I'm going to use him as an example. Is me and Steve, and we're going to specialize in each one of us doing something. We become very efficient at it, and it's great because we can trade with each other. But what happens if Steve decides to hold me up? He's not going to sell me what he has become a specialist in, and I never really put any time in learning how to do that activity and scaling it up. Now, unfortunately, the mechanism that originally was generating the gains from trade was one that said, I'm going to give up on this activity, and therefore, when Steve threatens me, I have no alternative. So what do I think about? I think about rebalancing. I start thinking, well, I'm going to do a little bit of both. I'm going to be a little bit inefficient, but I'm going to be very secure, because if he ever threatens me, I have an alternative. I'm Europe, and I start thinking I should have some manufacturing. I should have some steel plants. Turns out I'm not very good at it. The economies of scale are not there, but I need to have some of this. Or if I'm the BRICS or China, I start thinking I better have my own payment system. It's not good. It's not as good as the global one, but I got to have something if I get threatened. Ultimately, as we all start doing this, the risk is that we become overly secure at the expense of fragmenting globalization. It's worse than that, because globalization is a little bit like a social media. You want to be on these global systems because everybody else is on it. There are strategic complementarities. So as we all start to move away, the global system becomes less and less appealing, and we get a fragmentation doom loop. The last thing that I'm going to say, which I think is particularly relevant to the world we live in right now, in the month of April 2025, is thinking about commitment. The problem is, if you're one of these big, powerful countries, and you bully the rest of the world all the time, they're going to react. And they're going to react by moving away from you, by not wanting to deal with you because they're constantly afraid of being bullied. Ultimately, that dissipates your own power. If you have no relationship with these countries, you have nothing left to threaten them. So if you think about the world that we've lived in since World War II, like a world of multilateral commitments, international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, or what became the WTO, rather than thinking of them as the incarnation of some global planner that wants to do it for everybody, think of them as the incarnation of a hegemon that is offering a particular deal in its favor. It's saying, come into my network. I'm going to tie my hands a little bit. I'm not going to bully you that hard. I'm going to ask you for some stuff, but not all the time and not very aggressively. And ultimately, because you participate, I end up with more power, not less power. And this is a lesson that one can easily forget, and it can be expensive for everybody, including the current hegemon. Now, enough with words. I'm going to do some simple math and then bring it to a data. And then the rest is, I promise you, is only measurement, okay? It's what's going on in the world. Okay, so what are sufficient statistics? So we said you have a choke point if you really control a big chunk of a sector and it's very difficult to move away from it. So you can scale this up to many, 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 many different sectors, but I'm going to pick a simple example. I'm going to focus on two sectors. One, the entire manufacturing of goods and services, and another, financial services. And I'm going to plot two things. The US coalition, which essentially includes Western Europe and a lot of other G10 countries, and the Chinese coalition, which think of it as largely China. What I'm plotting is, for the rest of the world, what fraction of their imports in a particular sector comes from these coalitions? And something very obvious appears. First, you can see it here, the US and the Western coalition does have a big presence in manufacturing, but it has an extraordinarily high presence in finance. Very often, it controls 90% or 95% of all financial service imports from any country in the world. It's familiar to you that if you're trying to make an international transaction, custody assets, borrow, you're bumping into a Western financial institutions pretty quickly, particularly across borders. When you look at China, they do have an incredibly high penetration rate on manufacturing exports or imports from other countries, particularly if you think that this is a single country. So that's perfectly true. They have almost no presence in finance. So you can see that these two hegemons are very different. One is very finance-focused, one is very manufacturing-focused. If you compute how much power they get to exert on the rest of the world, country by country, what do you find? First, you find that for the US, finance is really important. It's a very important choke point for the US-led coalition, which accounts for the fact that the US does indeed use a lot of financial sector sanctions when it wants to punish bad actors. Of course, it gets some power from manufacturing, particularly for countries like Mexico that are very close by and have very heavy trade in goods. When you look at China, it has a lot of power over Eastern Asia. It comes out with mostly from manufacturing, with the exception of Singapore, precisely because Singapore is an offshore financial center for China. It has very, very close financial ties to China. So you can see that the composition of power is very different, both geographically and in which sectors these countries have their power rely on. To make it fun, I also pulled Russia. So the green line is Russian imports of financial services from the Western coalition. You can see that before the invasion of Crimea in 2014, almost all financial services were coming from the Western coalition. Then after the invasion of Crimea, in part because of sanctions, in part maybe because the Russian government anticipated some future trouble, they started rebalancing, creating some financial ties with East Asia, but also rebalancing to a domestic system. They started to beef up what is obviously a very inefficient system, but it is a home alternative if you want to sustain some financial transactions. Ultimately, they didn't really move away that much. The numbers go from 95% to 85%. But because power is so nonlinear, it's the logic of choke points in reverse. That simple movement cuts the power of the coalition on Russia by 50%, because it moves you away from the extreme where they have no alternative. Now, you can think of this as a bad message, but you can think of it also as a positive message. If you think about countries doing economic security, it tells you that you don't have to fragment a lot to be very secure. You don't have to go to the Hirschman world where everything is in equal shares. It's just enough to move away from these huge nonlinearities to really decrease power a lot at the cost of relatively little security. OK, now this is the fun part. We released a paper about 2 hours ago. And so take everything I'm going to say with a grain of salt. But we're very excited about it, and we think it can have a positive impact on the world out there. So I wanted to show it to you. I mentioned with the example of ASML that it's very difficult to observe threats. Some of the most powerful threats never occur because the target complies. If a European bank gets told, please don't trade with Iran or we disconnect you from the US system, they will comply. If ASML needs to lose its entire access to US technology, they will likely comply. So it's very difficult to observe. However, market participants talk about this. I showed you the headlines at the beginning. Between news, analyst reports, the companies themselves, if they're public companies, at the earning calls, they're going to say the reason why we moved out of the China market is because there was pressure from the US government that we would have to sell less of this particular machinery to China. So the traditional approach would be have a team of RAs, read these things and summarize them for you. That's totally infeasible if you're looking for a few 100,000 documents. The better approach, which was probably available for the last 10 years, is to do something close to a word search. It's called natural language processing or dictionary-based methods. Look in all these documents for the word tariff, sanctions. It's pretty good. It doesn't go very far, unfortunately, because it doesn't really tell you what exactly they were talking about. And so our own approach has been to leverage recent advances in AI, particularly large language models, that essentially really use the entire structure of the language to get out much more information. And I'll give you an example. On top of that, you can do this on a vast scale. Your major 3 problems are, first, how quickly the text becomes available. But in this day and age, it becomes available pretty quickly. Second, large computational power to process it. Third, our own time to figure out that we did this right. But other than that, you can do this in near real time. So what did we do? In this particular case, we looked at earning calls. These are company CEOs and CFOs talking with investors about what's happening to the company. And we look at analyst reports. These are banking analysts that cover that particular company and say what's happening to it. Okay? And there's a few 100,000 documents. We used models that are available from either Meta or Alibaba. The big advantage is these companies give you the entire model. You can put it on your own servers so that you control what's going on. You're not sending it to some API that tomorrow changes and you can't recover it. And since I'm a Stanford, I'm going to advertise that Stanford invests heavily in these things. And we use both our own lab computing power, but also the centralized computing power of the university with Marlowe. And just think of running these a lot. Now, what are you actually running? You're asking something like this. I think of it as what I would have written 15 years ago to give to my RAs to read the report and classify. Now you're asking the same thing to the machine. Please read this thing and tell me, are they talking about tariffs? Are they saying they're a good or a bad thing? How are they reacting? Are they saying, let's increase prices? Let's move away from a market? Or if they're being sanctioned, are they moving away? Are they finding a different customer or a different supplier? So think of doing this on a grand scale. Now, what happens when you do it in real time? So let me start from the most recent event, because you can see how big it is. That one actually does not include the April 2nd announcements, because it stops on the 31st. And I've looked at the data, but I was too afraid to show you because it was too shaky right now for what happens after. But think of this as just to the lead up to April 2nd. Every company and every analyst is saying we're going to be massively affected by tariffs. This is coming up. If you go a little bit farther back, you can see a spike in export controls and sanctions. Those are the Russian sanctions. When you actually look at what's going on, that's exactly what you pick up. And this blue spike for tariffs is the earlier Trump administration having the trade disputes with China. So at the aggregate, it looks pretty good. But you can go deeper. You can say, are you being affected by the current tariffs, or is this a threat of future things? And you can see that for both the sanctions and the export controls, this was largely realizations. The sanctions were imposed on Russia, and the company's report were affected by the current sanctions. But for the tariffs, particularly from the recent quarter, a lot of this is, I know that this is coming. I'm not that affected by the current one, but I think I'm going to be affected from the future. You can go even deeper. You can say, how did you react? And this is kind of fascinating. This is really where you see the power of these AI models. Well, first, for tariffs, they're saying, I'm going to move prices. And when you check which direction the prices go, it's up. They're going to say, I'm going to pass some of this into my pricing. When you look at market exit, it's the opposite. It's mostly driven by export controls and sanctions. They're telling me that I need to move out of the Russian market, so it's quantity driven. And then, of course, everybody is reacting by, I'm going to try to rearrange my supply chains so that I can get either around the sanctions or survive them in some sense. So we're going to keep updating these very fast as the events unfold. And hopefully provides a real-time view of what's happening in the world during probably the biggest shock to these topics, and certainly in my lifetime, probably in collectively all of our lifetimes. Let me conclude by saying, look, I cannot think of a more pressing global challenge that economists and social scientists in general should be working on. We have to get answers to this. We have to try to provide information, provide ways to think about optimal policy. There's lots and lots of things to do. This is just the beginning. But this is very likely to have a big effect on our lives, and hopefully we can make the situation better. Now, let me conclude by saying, if there was something that you didn't like, the fault is not mine. It's from all of my co-authors and all of the people that work in my lab that did the work. So many of them are sitting here. We run a lab at Stanford, and everything I just told you is really joint work with Chris Clayton, who's at Yale, and Jesse Schrager, who's at Columbia. And particularly everything that has to do with AI is led by my young colleague, Antonio Coppola, who's here. He's the leader of those projects. And really, you should complain to him for anything that you didn't like about it. So let me stop here, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Matteo. Terrific lecture. Fascinating. Really fantastic. It's striking that the recent increased attention to this trade-off between economic security and the gains from trade kind of coincides with the rise of China as a large country in the global economy, connected with the topic of today's lecture. And so it feels like we're sort of potentially living through a transition between a single global hegemon of the United States and then the rise of a major new economic power. One of the things that seems different now from previous transitions, such as, say, Britain and Germany or Britain and the US in the early 20th century, has been the emergence of global value chains. And so this sort of fragmentation of the world economy through increased emphasis on economic security could be particularly costly in a world of global value chains. And I wondered if you had any kind of thoughts as to how things are likely to play out and how this increased emphasis on economic security, to what extent it will be more costly than in the past.
Yeah, I think this is an excellent question. So let me make 3 points in response. The first is, indeed, Steve is completely right, that the world is different from what it looked like during the Cold War, for example, where the two blocs were largely separate, and the US was doing export controls with COCOM, largely saying we don't want to have some technology go to the Russian side. But the two sort of spheres of influence are very separate. If you think of the world today with China, my second picture was these two are really competing, but at the same time, they're very interconnected with each other. We buy a lot of consumer goods from China. China is very reliant on US payment systems. They're very heavily intertwined. The second point is technology has changed dramatically. If you think about things that have strategic complementarities, for example, a lot of information technology, finance, these things have become a lot more dominant than they were 30 years ago, and they're a lot more portable. And so in some sense, they create much more of the incentives to fight over dominance because they create a lot more dependency than when we're very, very localized. If we were all just doing cement and it's largely non-tradable and you can go next door, that's pretty limited. But if you're doing information technology, semiconductors, and finance, there's a global market with a lot of dependency to fight over. And finally, it's very clear that the US has offered a particular deal to the rest of the world in a moment after the Cold War, where it was really the sole superpower. And the emergence of this big competitor is creating lots of sort of interactions. One that I will mention is think of Singapore as a financial center. So for the US, controlling Singapore, it's really about generating a choke point. It's making sure that that's the other thing that they can add to their list to control all of the global financial system. For China, having a tight control over Singapore is the other way around. It's not going to make China a financial superpower, but it's about denying it to potentially a competitor. It's making sure they don't get to corner the market. And so there's a lot of competition that goes on in rare earths finance that has that feature. Please. I will go.
First, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. When you're showing that analysis of the financial versus the goods and services and manufacturing centered one, I wondered how micro can you go? And if we were to look at a situation, let's say, of Taiwan and TSMC, right? Where if you were to look at the nonlinearity, how much of the production would have to maybe come to the US where a nonlinearity kicks in, where all of a sudden the silicon shield isn't so, it becomes much more porous, because I would assume the Taiwanese would be very interested in that critical point, but also from the US's point of view, it's critical for the opposite reason. And so I was wondering, does your system allow that kind of analysis for a very specific type of scenario like that?
It's a brilliant question. The short answer is not really. So there's a trade-off in general in, this is a question about the quality of the data or the data that is available for analysis. So the more disaggregated you go, the more you start losing coverage. And it's a very important question whether the level of disaggregation is sufficient to figure out these kinks. So if you're a network theorist in economics, you might think that the nonlinearity is really down to that particular producer on that route. And I'll give you an example with the financial sector. I put together all sorts of financial services, but that's commingling SWIFT with credit cards, with custody, and you might think that, for example, some of these services are fairly innocuous, and really the nonlinearity is all concentrated in the SWIFT payment system. And so that's a totally valid question. It's part of the reason why I'm very excited about this agenda, is that the microdata has becoming more and more available. And so, for example, for financial markets, a lot of my lab traditionals work has been there. You can get very, very detailed information. Trade is also getting a lot better. Services are quite a mess. And we're trying to get there. And so Steve mentioned a lot of progress, not only in the world in terms of value chains, but also in terms of our ability to track them. That's part of the excitement. It's very clear that every government and every firm right now is thinking about how much do I know about my dependencies through my exact network. And my sense is that very much like what we saw after the global financial crisis or COVID, research, once we get our collective heads together, can go pretty quick. And so I'm hopeful that a couple of years from now, we will have answers that are substantially better than what I gave you today. But you're onto a very big topic that we're all thinking about.
Yeah, I have two related questions. So this is a geopolitical model, right? So do you consider domestic political system? Because China, US are very different, right? But this will affect the two countries' objective functions, right?
Yes.
So the second question is that you will consider two countries, basically, right? Can the other countries, smaller countries, form a union to change the geopolitics, like European Union or other countries, Southeast Asian countries?
Yeah, these are, again, great questions. So let me take the first one, which is these are models where the political economy matters a lot, not only across countries, but also within country. So I mentioned it briefly. Think of the US imposing, as they did apparently earlier this afternoon, further restrictions on NVIDIA. From NVIDIA's perspective, that's privately costly. They're going to make a loss. The argument from the government is that that loss is justified in the collective sense that ultimately it's in the national interest in the US and improves the collective welfare of the US. But that gives you a clear disconnect between the incentives of NVIDIA and its stakeholders and the collective US households or the welfare function that the government has. Now, governments organize very differently around this. So you could imagine, for example, that China, with much more of a state centralized control to the state enterprises, is on the one hand more directly able to dictate what they might or might not do, but on the other hand, that might dissipate some of the power, precisely because those companies are not going to invest very heavily. They're thinking that maybe they don't want to innovate a lot. On the other hand, the US has traditionally put much more limitations on the central power, although clearly we're seeing a lot of exertion of power right now. But ultimately, that might be beneficial because you do get to have NVIDIA. And you have to think of a world where those companies would have developed if they were constantly being used for other objectives. But it's certainly a crucial topic. You can also make it a little bit more nefarious. You might think that if you want to buy protection, the easiest thing to do is to say that the country has to do it in your national interest. So the Russian Premier Khrushchev used to hate the word strategic and had this fantastic joke that you can make anything you want strategic. You can make buttons for trousers strategic, because if the soldier doesn't have the buttons, he has to hold the trousers with a hand, and how is he going to shoot with the other hand alone? So this gets pretty politicized pretty quickly. A part of what we try to do is precisely definitions, measurements, so that you can't say my sector is strategic. You have according to a definition and measurement, really justified. To the second part of your question, absolutely. So here, the small countries might want to form defensive coalitions. Let me give you an obvious example. If you're the European Union, you want economic security to be done at the centralized level. Because France, Germany, and Italy, if they do it independently, each will want to have a steel plant, a nuclear plant, and manufacturing. They're not very good at it, and at least if we do it collectively at the European Union level, we internalize the effects on each other. And so coalitions are very important in this setting. Please.
Thank you. Also, I found the talk very interesting. I'm wondering, if you've quantified to the extent to which choke points specifically actually exist in terms of the non-linearities you identified. And part of the reason I'm wondering is the big examples we've seen recently, whether it's export controls of high-tech goods to China or the sanctions on Russia, they both seem like they'd be good examples of powers that have the ability to use choke points and yet not really succeeding in either dimension. So China obviously has nevertheless been incredibly successful in developing its high-tech industry despite all the restrictions that have been imposed. The Russia sanctions, despite being imposed, have basically the U.S., Europe, Canada, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, nevertheless remarkably effective at being able to access a lot of high-tech imports that they need to wage the war. I mean, is it only a situation where like small countries can be pushed around, or is it a sense to which the cost of the country imposing it? What do you see as limitations? Thank you.
That's a very good question. So, in practice, quantitatively, the power of substitution, it's extremely strong. I mentioned, for example, for Russia, the Western coalition has tried to starve them of oil and gas revenues, but there were plenty of alternative buyers, and they turned out to be big buyers, and so that hasn't had as big of an impact as you would have hoped. So you can think of it as that wasn't as big of a choke point as people would have thought. The other example that I like is oil on the other hand. Think of controlling one variety of oil. That gives you no power, because if you stop selling, somebody else is going to sell, and most varieties of oil are pretty close substitutes. So it's really about controlling the entire supply, forming a cartel that will give you a lot of influence. But then the US becomes self-sufficient or even an exporter, and that goes away. So it's really a joint combination of technological substitutability, but also who in equilibrium controls what, and can you get them into your coalition. The other example is semiconductors. In practice, it's been pretty difficult to control that supply chain, precisely because there's so many companies involved, so many different creative ways to get around it. And first you say, I'm not going to give you the most advanced chip. But it turns out that if you're smart, you can do a lot with the one that is a little worse. And then we try to chase you out of that one. Why are they focusing on lenses or lithography machines so much? Because those seem to be the few things where currently there is no alternative. But then, as I mentioned, that's a short-term statement. Countries invest in their own ability to self-insulate. And so ultimately, you're going to try to build those machines yourself. And how difficult is it to do that? Well, it's not certainly trivial, but particularly for large countries with a lot of skilled labor force, ultimately you might be able to. One that has been successful on the other hand of the extreme is the financial system. It's been very, very difficult to move away from the centrality of the dollar and SWIFT. China has been trying to build its own payment system with some success, but they're very, very far away from a fully successful system. And those financial sanctions have been painful. And so I think one of the messages of our work is you want to be careful with claiming that you can threaten this or that, because most threats turn out not to be very powerful once you estimate them. And you might think too much in the sort of short run and with almost no substitutability. And that leads to an overexertion of power with ultimately just, either no consequence or bad consequences in the sense that you think you're doing it, but nothing is really happening.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. So when the tariffs were announced, both the stock market and the bond market crashed, right? And that a lot of people were saying that the bond market was a big reason why he pulled back. If we think about the bond market, right, China's the second largest holder globally of U.S. treasuries. How does that play into your framework for geoeconomics?
So it doesn't really relate so much to this framework, but some years ago I was doing a lot of research on this. Again, you have to think about the second best buyer. I always thought that the threat to sell U.S. treasuries was totally vacuous. Either the treasury will buy them back or somebody else is going to buy them at a discount, and why not? Now, there is one exception, is you could run the U.S. into a lot of fiscal trouble where now you're really betting on lenders rolling over your debt and not causing a rollover crisis. But if you keep your house in order, there's plenty of buyers of good bonds. And if they want to dump them, somebody else is going to buy them for some discount. And it's not going to really cause a major financial crisis. If you get to where Italy was, and you're kind of hoping that somebody's going to buy your debt, the ECB or whoever else steps in to offer it and save you from a financial crisis can have a lot of power. And this has happened in the past. So many of you might remember this, but when Britain and in part France invaded the Suez Canal in the, I guess it's the late 50s, I hope I get the dates right, Britain was undergoing a balance of payments crisis. So they were essentially experiencing the beginning of the onset of a financial crisis. And they approached the US and said, please give us extra liquidity, either you or the IMF through you. And the US administration threatened them with suffering through the crisis if they were not going to withdraw the military from Suez. And actually Britain complied. But you have to get yourself into that spot where the withdrawal of support, of financial support, is very expensive. If Britain was in a good fiscal state and without a balance of payments crisis, the threat wouldn't have been very valuable. And so this goes back to where do you have choke points. They're not just technological. They're about a particular economic situation and equilibrium that require Britain being under dire straits financially, the US being the only large lender of last resort to them, and the fact that there was no alternative. If any of those three things were not true, this would have been a short conversation with the diplomat saying, do what you want, I'm going to keep pursuing my foreign policy. So I think we're done.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are drinks.
Thank you, and thank you to Professor Maggiori for talking with us today about geoeconomics in the U.S.-China great power competition. We greatly appreciate you speaking with us. I would also like to thank Zhaowei Xu for our Chinese Studies librarian, Sonia Li, the Associate Director of Development for the Libraries, and Hannah Firestone at GSB, and Regina Johnson at Sky for planning and coordinating today's events. Let's also thank Sky for their continued participation and support of this lecture series. So please join me now for the reception outside and for more conversation. Thank you.
Only China and the United States have big tech. Europe, Britain, nothing, zero. We are irrelevant. I know it's very harsh to say that, but Britain and the European Union better understand that these Brexit discussions and all that stuff that has been occupying us now for the last 7 years has rendered us irrelevant without cloud capital.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Gurumurthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is the Greek economist Yanis Varoufakis. He was, briefly, in 2015, the Greek finance minister during the height of the debt crisis. He has been involved in electoral politics in his own country. He has campaigned around Brexit and been very involved with the Labour Party in this country. But he recently lost his parliamentary seat himself. He is the author of many books, and his latest is called Techno-Feudalism: What Killed Capitalism. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's go through this very simply. I mean, first of all, feudalism. By feudalism, I imagine medieval peasants who are effectively forced to live on the land of their lords and masters. They give him a slice of their produce or their income, yes, and they are basically bound to him and have no freedom. Is that what you mean by feudalism?
That's what we mean by feudalism, but not by techno-feudalism.
So what is techno-feudalism?
I'm glad you started with feudalism, because the great transformation which has created the modern world was the one from feudalism to capitalism. As you correctly put it, feudalism was a socio-economic system predicated upon land and land ownership. So the aristocracy owned the land, it got a lot of economic, social, political power. It was all one thing back then. There was no distinction. If you had political power, you had economic power, unlike under capitalism. And the wealth was transferred to the ruling class, to the aristocracy, through, as you put it, rent. Taking a slice of the produce, of the harvest of the peasants who didn't labor for a wage. There was no labor market. You couldn't quit. You didn't receive a wage. You just kept that which the landlord or the sheriff operating on the landlord's behalf would leave behind after the harvest was in. Then you had a fantastic transformation, the great transformation, as Karl Polanyi put it, from feudalism to capitalism. Power shifted from those who owned land to those who owned the machines, the steam engines, the factories, the steamships, the telegraphs, the later on electrical power generating systems. And wealth came from accumulation not of rents, but of profits. So you had commodification of land. Suddenly land became a commodity when the enclosures, chucked out of the land the peasants and replaced them with sheep, if you remember, of course you remember. And this is the beginning of the modern world, of modernity as we know it. Now, what am I saying with techno-feudalism? I'm saying that capital triumphed so magnificently that it mutated. It created a mutant version of it, which I call cloud capital. So what is the difference between cloud capital and normal capital? Take an industrial robot. That's traditional capital. It's very snazzy, it's very technologically advanced, it moves its own, it's got electronics in it, software and all that. But it does more or less the same job that the steam engine did. It automates production in the factory. Cloud capital is this network of machines and software which allows us to talk to one another, big tech. My hypothesis is that this new version of capital, cloud capital, is a very different beast from industrial robots and steam engines. And anyone who owns it owns effectively a new form of digital land. Think of Amazon.com. It's like a cloud thief. It's a thief that lives in the cloud, effectively on a bed of cloud capital, which allows the new lord, Jeff Bezos, or whoever owns that particular piece of digital land, to charge rents. Because Jeff Bezos doesn't produce anything that you buy on Amazon, same with the owners of Alibaba and so on. What they do, however, is they charge 40%. Think about it, 40% is a gigantic rent on the price of everything that is sold to you on Amazon.com. Now, this is not a theoretical point. My point, the point I'm trying to make in the book, is that this is a great transformation, which, if you put your mind to it, it explains the reason why we have so much anxiety in the world. We have this polycrisis. The crisis of today is nothing like the crisis of the 1970s, even the cost of living crisis. The inflation we have today bears no resemblance to the inflation that we experienced in the 1970s. You had a period of deflation, a period of inflation. You have this gigantic disconnect between the amount of money in the economy. We never had so much money as we have now, globally speaking, across the West or the whole world. And yet investment is at the lowest level in proportion to how much money there is in the economy. And I do believe the answer lies in this fantastic transformation, very violent transformation of a world from capitalism to something that I call techno-feudalism, which is, of course, based on enormous quantities of capital, unlike the older version of feudalism that you described.
So there's a lot to unpack there. So in terms of the analogy of rent and who are the serfs? Are the serfs all of us, or are they? Who is paying the rent? Is it the makers of the goods that Amazon is selling, or what?
The rents themselves are paid by the capitalists. So if you're producing a bicycle or a book, and you sell it through Amazon, through Alibaba, through a myriad of such platforms, now doing amazing business in Indonesia, in Africa. It's not just a Western phenomenon, right? Of course, in China. If you are producing stuff, material goods or services or movies, you sell them through that kind of cloud feed, and you pay rent. For the very first time in the history of humanity, capital is being produced or reproduced by people who are not being paid as wage laborers. So every time you post a review on Amazon, you walk around London or drive around London with your phone, and the phone is pinging Google Maps where you are.
And producing data.
So Google Maps becomes more valuable because it can predict congestion. So you are contributing to the capital of these large conglomerates without being a paid laborer. I call that a cloud serf. Now, interestingly, when I was researching this book, I discovered that on average, conglomerates of the old capitalist type pay about 80 to 85% of their revenues to workers. Facebook pays 1%. Why? Because Facebook, the capital of Facebook, is produced for free by everybody who creates their own pages, posts messages, and sends reviews to one another, and so on.
But
this is all free labor.
Yeah, but they would say this is not labor. This is not people working for us.
It is
This
work.
is people getting a product by choice. No one's forcing them to do it. They are choosing to use the platform that Facebook is, or whichever platform you might be talking about. And they are getting a convenience out of it. They're getting a service from that.
But that's irrelevant. It is true that people do it voluntarily. I do it. I couldn't live without my phone, without my TikTok, without my. I'm an addict as well. Right?
So are they
I
serfs?
I volunteer. But voluntary serfdom is the worst kind of serfdom. But anyway, this is not an ethical point I'm making. It doesn't matter whether you're forced or we are not forced. The fact is that you're doing a lot of work. All these kids with uploading TikTok videos, they love it. If you took it away from them, they would hate you, especially if you're a parent, as I am, and I'm sure you are. But nevertheless, the fact remains, they put a lot of work. They don't think of it as work. But it is work. And it is work that is replenishing the capital stock of TikTok. Now, that from a macro perspective is crucial because you have capital being reproduced without wage labor. Now, why is it important? Because wage labor means that there are wages that are being paid, and those wages contribute to the demand for things in the marketplace. When you have all this labor producing capital, but it is not remunerated, that shrinks aggregate demand macroeconomically. And what does that mean? It means that central banks cannot get away without printing more money to replenish the demand. But then, especially when you have an inflationary cost of living crisis as we do now, there is a clash of objectives. On the one hand, to arrest rising prices, but on the other hand, if you don't print the money, because you have so much work that is not remunerated, then aggregate demand is shrinking. This is why central bankers are in a state of apoplexy. They do not know what to do. They are damned if they do, raise interest rates, and they're damned if they don't. So this is not a theoretical book, from my perspective. It's an attempt to understand the world we live in, including at the micro level, at the level of our kids. My concern is also a concern that the liberals should have about the concept of the liberal individual, because if you think about it, once upon a time, there was a strict demarcation between work and play and leisure.
And that's gone.
And that is gone. And it is gone because if you're producing capital, even in your sleep, more or less, if you are in a society where, I've been a professor for many years before I got into politics, I noticed that young people now are constantly angst-ridden about their social media. Why? Because they know that when they apply for a job, the interviewing panel will look at their social media. So they are constantly trying to create the self which they think is going to sell in the labor market. Now, this is all happening subconsciously and voluntarily, but it means that there is no autonomy of the liberal individual anymore. It also means that we can have no social democracy. The social democratic parties are bunk.
So you think in reality it is not really possible to opt out of all of this and just say, I'm not doing it?
It's possible, but you have to become a neo-Luddite. You've got to switch off the phone, get an old Nokia that cannot connect to the internet. I know people who do that. But it's not an escape route for society. It may be an escape route for the individual, but it can't be an escape route for humanity.
So why is this something that replaces capitalism rather than is just part of it?
It depends on how you define capitalism. My definition of capitalism is a system that has two pillars. One is markets. Unlike feudalism, when we shifted from feudalism to capitalism, markets did all the work in terms of coordinating human activities. Everything is either sold through a market or purchased at a marketplace. So markets, one pillar of capitalism. The second is profits. What lubricates capitalism, what makes capitalism grow and continue and all that is profit making. If I'm right with my hypothesis in techno-feudalism, both are now gone. They're sideshows. Of course there is profit. The profit motive is everywhere. Of course there are markets everywhere. But they are optional now. Jeff Bezos does not make his money out of profits. He collects rents.
Isn't it the same thing?
No, it's exactly the opposite. The reason why capitalism was such a major advancement or such a revolutionary change from feudalism was because of the shift from rents that were collected for no productive effort and for no entrepreneurial activity of the aristocrats to profits. Jeff Bezos is, of course, a brilliant entrepreneur in creating this digital landscape over which he has monopoly property rights, which he uses to collect the rents. So that is macroeconomically very significant because of the depression